Hi, and welcome to Power of 10, a podcast about design operating at many levels, zooming out from thoughtful detail through to organisational transformation, on to changes in society and the world. My name's Andy Polaine. I'm a design and innovation consultant, design leadership coach, educator, and writer. My guest today is making her second appearance on Power of 10. It's Tutti Taygerly. Welcome, Tutti.
Thank you, Andy. Excited to be on.
Tutti is an executive leadership coach and professional speaker, for those of you who haven't heard her in the last time. She supports CEOs and tech leaders to embrace their unique leadership style to achieve professional impact. She works closely with women, people of colour, and immigrants, and has a particular love for difficult, in air quotes, people. Previously, she was the design leader at design firms, startups, and large companies, including Disney and Facebook. She's written for Business Insider and Fast Company, and she's just written a new book called Make Space to Lead that shows high achievers how to reframe our relationship to work. Tutti, welcome.
Thank you.
So, the last time we spoke was a while ago, we were just saying, kind of near the beginning of this pandemic, actually. I think it was the beginning of last year, or spring last year. So you've been on quite a personal journey, it seems, in that time. What have you been up to since the last time I spoke?
Oh, so much. I think the last time we spoke, I was in the middle of coach training through the Coactive Institute. And since then, I think that I've stepped into feeling really comfortable as an entrepreneur with, hate to use this word, but with a portfolio of work, from supporting CEOs of startups, leaders in tech companies, designers and non-designers in one-on-one coaching, running group programs, running my first in-person retreat, which was beautiful. It was about a month ago to actually work with a group of women in person. And then for a lot of this last year, I've been writing. Hence this book coming out. A lot of the thinking and framing and I would say sharpening of the different messages that I've been going through myself and working with people on coming out in the book.
So I've got a question. Have you been busy?
Andy. So I think they say that we teach what we most need to learn. I've been working with two separate book coaches over this year and writing the book, and this is what happens in our sessions. They always start with, how busy have you been? How packed has been your schedule? And it's actually the second book coach who basically gave me a very inspired tip, which is to only write when I'm in flow. And I find that happens the most if I start out the morning surfing. So if I start out the morning out in the ocean, surfing, relax, when I come back, all I want to do is write. So I am busy, but it's a state of being, I would say, not busy. I'm actively in flow, creating, producing a lot of things. And yes, I am busy a lot too.
Yeah. Okay. As you know, it was a facetious question, because obviously this is one of the things you're talking about, is making space and actually getting away from the busyness. And, I had a little kind of European chuckle there was a line in the book where you said, it's only when we take a longer vacation of a week or preferably 2 or 3, which for Europeans is a short, 3 weeks is a short vacation, right?
Absolutely. It's very American to be, 4 days, that's my vacation.
Yeah. So, it's incredible how that kind of, and it's getting shorter and shorter. It's actually happening in Australia quite a lot. Australia used to be quite good on that. And it's now, I think, one of the nations who have kind of the least kind of vacation. America still tops the list. You talked about surfing a lot, actually, in your book. I got the feeling that there was a lot of thinking around the book whilst you were surfing. Not thinking, I don't know if that's true. A lot of what I would call the sort of the stewing, I think writing a book or writing anything actually is a large part of kind of, for me, I call it stewing. I talked to an Italian the other day who said, it's a minestrone, right? It's one of those things you have to kind of let it gradually cook to really get out the flavors. But I think it's one of those things, to make sense of it. So how much was inspired by surfing? Because you even have an acronym in there too, right?
I do. I do have an acronym to remember the state of being by SURF, S-U-R-F. But to your question, I remember when I worked actively as a design leader making products, I talked a lot about gestation time, which is the same thing, this stewing time, this minestrone time. And I don't even think it's for writing. I think it's for everything we do, whatever thing we're trying to make, create, problem solve. And absolutely, I do that when I surf. Not necessarily in the active part of paddling, going for a wave, riding the wave, but in a lot of the sitting. I think many people think that surfing is a very active sport because when you see it, you see people up and riding the wave and going down the line. But the reality is you spend a lot of time sitting. Spend a lot of time sitting, floating, bobbing, watching the horizon to see when the next set is going to come. And that is very conducive for introspection. And to your point around around what I call gestation, it's you let an idea sit with you overnight for a couple days when you're in the shower, when you're out walking, or for me, after when I'm out surfing, that's when something pops and then you know what to do next. You know, you get an insight, you get something to unstick you and show you the path forward.
Yeah, I think there was I think it's Adam Grant. There was a sort of thing that he had written a little while, and you probably posted it too, but I saw it sort of was one of those things that a tweet of his kind of went around and about this idea of, downtime or is not wasted time. Mm-hmm. And this idea, and I really find that, if you're really, really busy, you just don't have kind of time to think. And my belief is, and I'll be interested seeing you coach some of these people, I have a kind of belief that I think CEOs should be the least busy people in the organization because their decisions carry often the greatest weight, and therefore they should have some time to kind of think about those things. And the opposite is usually the case, right? I mean, I've had plenty of situations where someone said, well, okay, we've got 15 minutes with the CEO to present this thing for, and it's some really kind of important thing or millions of dollars. And I think, who thinks they can make a decision like that in 15 minutes without some reflection and some time? What's your view on this? Because you coach CEOs, right? Especially of startups, right?
I do. So two perspectives on this, and this is related to zooming up and down as well. My guess is that for some of the CEOs that I coach, they have different perspectives on a problem. So if it is a problem that most of the time their teams, the people who work for them can handle, then at some points in time, 15 minutes is enough because they've built up the context of it over time. They understand it. Especially most of the CEOs I coach are founders, co-founders, which means they are deeply, passionately embedded in the space of their company. So in a way, they understand it and have been with the ideas and concepts longer than anyone else. So with that, I'd say for some of these more zoomed down decisions, 15 minutes, I think, is enough. And all of these CEOs still struggle with what is the day-to-day firefighting crisis, and then how do you zoom out and make space, make time to look at what is long-term out. And long-term can be 6 months. It can be 2, 3, 5 years. And for that, I believe they need the time and the space. My cat is just on my lap, so you might hear her purrs.
Yeah, your cat is making space. They were fighting earlier too, so if anyone hears that in the background, I find it quite relaxing. It's one of those things you could just kind of put on loop. I could just be silent for a second and let people record it.
Well, it's the vibration of her on my lap. That is another thing that reminds me to slow down and make space because I've got to pet my cat.
Yeah, cats aren't particularly hectic animals, are they? They're quite soothing. So, there's lots we could talk about around your book. You've called it Make Space to Lead, and you're very honest and open in your own story. It's kind of leading there, and it sort of runs all the way through of your kind of own experience. And, you're very honest about this relationship between what you call your achievement monster and finding somehow the other side of it. But working in a culture and in an environment where everyone's meant to have an achievement monster or be one. And, hopefully, if we're doing it right, mine's better than yours and all of that stuff. It's sort of hyper-competitive. And I've got a bunch of questions around here, but at what point did you feel like, here's something I think I can kind of share and I can write about? Was there a kind of trigger to this, or was it something that brewed over time?
So I think the biggest trigger for writing externally about this was to really capture and better understand my own process. A lot of researchers talk a lot about research is actually me-search, trying to understand more of our own personal growth and journey. And while I've always journaled, I had not publicly written and blogged. And that's something that I started doing when I left the corporate world. I think I wrote my first public blog the month where I stopped working at Facebook, my last corporate job.
Yeah.
And for me, that was never intended to be a book or anything like that. It was more, hey, this is a journey that I'm going through. I found these messages have resonated with a lot of my peers, especially many design leaders during performance review season or trying to have more of a say in the roadmap. We'll put our hands up and be like, why are we doing this? Why are we putting so much of our hearts and souls into it? I'd talked to a lot of people feeling very overwhelmed and overworked, and this is even in the years pre-COVID. So there was something about it where I wanted to write to capture my journey and to share it with other people. And as we both know, Brené Brown talks about this catharsis of vulnerability, of sharing, of making a connection. And I think that was the soup altogether that had me start writing a blog weekly. For me, it didn't start as confessional. It started as sharing my learnings along the process. And only after doing that for about 2.5 some years was there, maybe after a year, maybe there was more of a point of view. There was a feedback loop. There were articles that resonated more with people and articles that were not read. So it was all an iterative feedback loop for experimentation. So while it started for me purely and selfishly, it became this way for me to connect with many, many people. And many people come in and find me through my writing right now.
Yeah, I call that sort of poking the hornet's nest. You put sort of articles out there and sometimes nothing happens, and another time, often it's the things that, I a little bit throw away almost, what I call brain farts, they're just a little thing. And I think, well, that was kind of interesting. Might have been something a turn of phrase that came up in coaching as a response to someone, and I kind of post it. And those ones suddenly kind of cause a lot of sort of hubbub in both directions, sometimes kind of positive and negative.
Absolutely.
So, maybe you could kind of talk through maybe there's a little bit of the kind of outline of the book. And I guess the other thing is, obviously, what do you hope that people are going to do with the book? Because there's obviously one thing is to write something or to present something. But the other part of it is, what do I want people to do with that?
You mentioned a little bit ago that I talk a lot about my achievement monster. And almost every person that I coach and almost every person I talked to when I was working at Facebook, when we got beyond the large meeting sessions and we sat down for coffee or had a one-on-one, everyone confessed to feeling imposter syndrome. It's the sense that I don't belong here. Everyone else is smarter, better than I am. And I'm a fraud because, who am I with my background, my training, or lack thereof, to sit here, be in this room amongst the other giants. And the reason why I bring those two things together is that we all have these voices. We all have these self-critics. I call it my achievement monster. One of my mentors and teachers, Shazad Shamin, calls it a saboteur or a judge that really tells us these voices that say that we're not doing it right. We're not good enough. We're messing up. We don't belong. And why talking about the achievement monster is one of the earlier chapters in the book is what I believe helps is realizing that these voices are here. A metaphor I use a lot with clients in tech is we've all heard of needing to have mentors and sponsors. Instead, think about in our internal landscape having a personal board of directors. And on this personal board of directors are all these voices. There may be this achievement monster voice sitting at the table. And at the same time, maybe there are other voices here of leaders that you've respected, of mentors that you have. And every time you're approaching or facing a choice or a decision, listen to all those voices, hear all of them, but know that the voice of the achievement monster is most likely lying. And getting familiar with all these voices, naming them, helps to bring it out into the light a little bit more and help overcome some of that imposter syndrome.
There's a book by Stephen Pressfield who wrote a book called The War of Art, and it was, it's a flip around of the art of war. And he does a brilliant thing in this. And he's talking about writing. He's a writer, and he's talking about all the things that get in the way of writing and some of the stuff we just talked about. But the brilliant thing he does is he talks about the resistance as if it's an external thing that's just out to get you. And it's really sneaky and it can get you in lots of different ways. And the reason why it's called the War of Art, it's kind of like how to spot the signs that the resistance is coming to get you and how to protect yourself from it. And of course, it's an internal thing. But the fact that he externalizes this as this external force makes it completely different in terms of the way you can relate to that. Instead of, oh, I'm lazy, I'm no good, I'm kind of rubbish. It's actually, this thing's out to get me and I'm going to stop it. It's really clever. And I think that aspect of naming things is incredibly important. And I don't know what your experience is. One of the things I've found with coachees sometimes is not only naming their things. I mean, you talk in your book about sort of naming your fears and kind of looking at your weaknesses and giving sort of different perspectives on them, but also toxic behavior from other people. And I don't mean sort of necessarily going out and combating that and sort of fighting it head on, but sometimes you can quietly name that to the person who's doing it, and it could be as simple as, it feels like you're trying to bully me here, what brings you to do that? That kind of completely diffuses and disarms sometimes, not always, but a lot of the time I think actually kind of naming the thing that's going on, the dynamic that's going in between sort of takes its power away. And I'm interested if you've found that at all with yourself or with your coaches.
Oh, absolutely. I'll tell a different side of the story because, as you said, I still am busy. I still struggle with making space to lead. And the story that you talked about, naming it, saying, oh, that feels a little bit like I'm being bullied, that really resonates with me because for many, many years as a leader, I was a very intense person, a so-called air quotes difficult person, if you will, because I was so passionate about the ideas. And it took multiple brave souls naming it to me, saying that the way that you talk about these ideas is like a hammer or a bulldozer. Doesn't leave space for anyone else to express their opinions. And something like that horrified me so deeply because I believe in diversity and inclusion and making sure everyone's voice is heard. So simply that act of naming is sometimes we can't see these things about ourselves. So I think it's up to leaders to help hold mirrors up to other people and name these traits in a way that can be really, really scary. Because if you're saying this to someone who's very intense and explosive and saying that, oh, I'm feeling bullied, that could blow up in your face and that can be really, really scary.
Yeah, that's why I said it sort of in about naming it in a fairly sort of quiet and not combative way. Because I think there's a difference to say, you're bullying me, and I'm feeling this, to saying, it seems like, this is what's going on here. Or, I know it's very subtle and it's a subtle language shift. I've got one little story. I was in a shared sort of studio space that I mistakenly kind of decided to kind of start to form a collective with some people who I didn't know that well, and a couple of people I knew very well. And one of the guys was a little bit immature. He was kind of, but very sort of alpha male-y. And I'm not really that kind of guy. And this is in Australia where there's quite a dynamic of that going on. I found him kind of terribly difficult. And then at one point we were having kind of a row about, as we were trying to separate the studio and I was trying to leave and stuff. And he was just kind of being bullying. And I just said, why are you trying to bully me at the moment in this? What do you hope to achieve? And he kind of burst forth and he said, because I'm a man. And then, I just burst out laughing. And it was just this kind of amazing moment where in that moment I named it, his whole kind of, in Jungian terms, his whole sort of shadow burst forth, and he kind of said the thing that he sort of secretly or unconsciously was feeling, and it kind of just it completely took away his power, of course. And then I was like, well, okay, I've won this argument now, right? But it just also for me just completely took away the dynamic. And whenever I've had that situation, and that's actually a thing. Bullying is a thing I respond. I wasn't even really bullied at school, but I respond badly, I think, to the unfairness or the sense of powerlessness. And I think, most people do.
Yeah.
And I found actually one of those things of kind of naming it in quite a kind of even way really helps. And I feel like a lot of what you're talking about in the book is really going inside and naming those things for yourself. And you are simultaneously sort of reducing the power of some things and increasing the power of the more positive things.
Absolutely.
And it's sometimes a bit counterintuitive, right? Like the thing about, talk about the thing where you talk about, there's a really, really nice activity about sort of taking different perspectives on your weaknesses.
Mm-hmm. Can I circle back to your story for a minute? And this is related to shifting perspectives. There's the naming of your story with the gentleman you shared the space with and the studio with. But the other part is that when you actually name something and get something out of the open, it can be really funny. As you said, you burst out in laughter.
Yeah.
I mean, some of our most tragic, highly emotional moments are extremely funny.
Yeah.
They shouldn't be, but they are. And having something be comic, ridiculous, completely outlandish also breaks the emotion and breaks the tension and allows different perspectives to come in. And one of the things that I've done a lot is I've been trained in improv.
Yeah. Yeah, you talk about that a bit in the book. Yeah.
And doing something outlandish, saying yes and in a brainstorm. Yeah. Yes, and we will bring my pet mouse into this particular design exercise and think about what my pet mouse might do with this concept or whatever else ridiculous thing. And pulling that back to the question you were asking, laughter, humor, outlandishness, that's one way of providing another different perspective.
Yeah.
And the problem is we get so stuck into the fact that these are my strengths and these are my weaknesses. One of the women that I was coaching was a very quiet leader. And she was convinced that it held her back. She was given feedback that this was a very outspoken company. She needed to express her opinion more forcefully. She needed to be a certain way because quietness was not part of the culture of this company. And so for a very, very long time, she absolutely knew and was stuck that this was a weakness. And this exercise you talk about, this perspective shifting, I worked on it with her because some of her strengths she was very empathetic. She was beloved by her team. She was very caring and supportive. And she was a slower, more contemplative thinker. There's so many different types of thinking. There are people who think very fast on their feet, and these are the people who win more in meetings because they have something to say immediately. They may be called the bullies in this scenario too, because they may dominate the conversation. And in these scenarios, it can feel that slowing down, not having an immediate response is not a good thing, that this quiet leadership is a weakness. So one exercise is flipping the perspectives, coming up with as many different possibilities about, well, what if being quiet was a strength? What if it was a strength because you can slow down the speed of the conversation and make sure that every person in the room is able to give their perspective so we don't mistakenly rush into a strategy that's going to blow up in our faces?
Yeah.
What if being quiet is a strength because you're going to be able to write your perspective, write your opinion, and send that in a follow-up email? Back to the CEO example. What if we take a couple of days to do this or a weekend before we make this decision, something else will come up, and a quiet leader may see that opportunity and open up the space for the team to do that. There's 3 off-the-cuff examples of how a perceived weakness could be a strength.
I really like that story, actually, because I think it's quite common. I do teach quite a lot. I coach as well. It's weird. I get kind of waves of female coaches and male coaches. And I had at one point quite a lot of female coaches, and this came up quite a lot for all the reasons you're saying, and particularly in Australia, where it's still a pretty blokey culture. It's still sort of fairly kind of loud blokey culture. And there tends to be that kind of dominance of the loud ones, at least, in a meeting. And this particular coach I'm thinking of, she was very smart, very able, really knew her stuff, had that thing of when I'm in this room now, I get, people ask me questions and I can't think of the kind of facts and figures or the stats or whatever it is off the top of my head, and I feel kind of frozen, and had imposter syndrome. And one of the things was to sort of get her to think about who else in the room knows more about design. She was a UX person, than you here in the room. Well, no one. That's why you're there, right? But she was constantly had this thing of, I shouldn't be here. And that kind of helped, first of all. And I had another coachee, though, who had that very thing of, I hate it when people put me on the spot to answer a question because I really like to think about it and I'm just not that kind of person. And so we worked on him just saying, can you give me just 10 minutes and I'll come back to you about that? And sometimes it was longer and I'll give you an answer by the end of the day or something like that. And the brilliant thing was they did a presentation to a client, and the most senior stakeholder was this woman who said at the end of the presentation, well, thanks very much. I really want to have a little think about everything you presented to me today, and I'll get back to you tomorrow. And it was just fantastic for him to see someone very, very senior do that. And I said, and how did it make you feel? And he went, well, actually really made me feel like she had heard everything we had been talking about and was taking it seriously, rather than just a kind of glib response and then walked out the door. So it was really, really nice to kind of have that moment where he saw someone very senior do exactly what he was kind of afraid of doing. Mm-hmm. And indeed, the more he did it, and it's a naming thing again, which is to say, I like to take some time to think about that thing rather than pretending that he was fine with coming up with an answer. And it really, really helped. I want to ask a question because you've come from a culture, and unfortunately, Facebook's is being pulled through the news a lot at the moment. But, in general, the tech industry, let's say in California or Silicon Valley, that is heavily there's a very, very strong culture of productivity, of doing more, of all the stuff that you kind of push against, or at least it's a sort of rallying cry against quite a lot of that in your book about, we need to make some space. I have a few coachees from that kind of milieu too, who, sometimes say, I feel like everyone else is better than me, is kind of going faster. But at the same time, then it kind of creeps into the conversation of, actually, I know loads of other people who are really close to burnout, but nobody wants to admit it. Mm-hmm. What do you think is going on? Where does that come from, in that culture? Why is that even there in the first place?
So I am really optimistic about Silicon Valley and tech culture. And I think that there is, it's complex and there's a paradox there. I think that there is a brilliant, shiny group of dreamers and thinkers who can imagine what a better world would be like with technology. And I think that in itself is a really beautiful thing. That's the North Star. That's the vision. That is, even if you want to call it the reality distortion field of Steve Jobs. Yeah. And the challenges come in the execution of it, because there is I think a false perception that it's urgent. We never have enough time. If we don't get to product market fit before a certain time, we're going to run out of money. If we don't release this new product line out, our competitors are going to get there first. If we're not first to market, we're going to lose. And there is very much this scarcity model of we must run faster, we must burn out, we must go as quickly as possible because otherwise someone is going to lose. And I believe that's part of our culture. It's part of the VC culture. It's part of what happens when you go public and what we do with exits. And what's challenging is that there's this beautiful thing of being able to imagine and visualize a better future, which is such a sense of abundance. And then this like short-term fear culture reward system, which is this performance review system, which happens every 3-6 months or every year. And it's those two pushing at each other, which causes this burnout, the sense of, even though everyone knows, yes, you need to work smarter, not harder. You're not on a clock. You are not required to work 60 hours a week. There is that fear that unless you do that, you won't be as good as everyone else.
Yeah, the peer pressure is strong, and that idea that there's only so much pie to go around.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think those are structurally resolvable? For me, those feel like, particularly the structural thing you just talked about in the second half of that feels like those are just destined never to be resolved.
So I think this is a challenging thing to resolve. And this is one of the reasons why I love working with CEOs of smaller companies and startups, because these are the conversations that we have together. How do we set up a company culture so that we are performant? We do hit some of these milestones. We make sure we keep marching towards product market fit while building a company culture of respect, equality, where we have people do their best work because they do want people to be their most creative and inspired, and working long hours does not help with that.
Do you think, to use the parlance of the tech industry, that good intentions scale?
Scaling is hard. Scaling is hard. I mean, having worked at Facebook, there are many, many good intentions, and the scaling of it is hard, which is why I think how you solve it first is you solve it within a smaller, more contained, 50 to 300 person startup.
Your problems scale too, right? So it feels like in that crazy sort of first bit of a startup where there really isn't any time and we're kind of running on a shoestring and everyone is working stupid hours, which I don't necessarily think you have to do. But, for all the reasons you've just said, if you don't take the time or make space to look at that and deal with that, then when are you going to? As you scale, you have even less chance to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or you get... I was talking to a previous podcast guest about this idea of sort of ethical debt. You kind of end up with this problem. I think you end up with sort of cultural or organizational debt there. It is way more difficult to pay off than technical debt.
No, absolutely. I think there is the right place for each individual person to be. And so a concept that I talk about a lot is force versus flow.
Yeah.
And I believe that there are periods in your life where if you are energized, if you are feeling alive, feeling excited and passionate about your work, there are periods of time where you can work very, very long hours. I don't believe it's sustainable for months or years. And so it's really about the rhythms, similar to the rhythms of the ocean and the waves. There's going to be times in your life where you can work with that intensity because it continues to fuel and energize you. And then there's going to be periods of time where it suddenly feels, oh, this is too much. That same number of hours, weekly hours that used to energize you now feel like they're burnout.
Yeah.
The hours may be the same, but what shifts is how your energy and excitement about it, based on a whole bunch of things, how well the project's going, the relationships between people at work, how long you've been doing this. And then that's the time at a personal level to shift. And what the message that I wanted to share with this book is that when you get to that stage, it's okay to make the space. It's okay to rest. It's okay to slow down. And that will make you, I believe, even more successful, even more energized, do even greater, bigger, more impactful work if you do take those periods of rest to slow down. So it's a difference between sometimes you do need to go, 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 and you're energized by it. And other times you're not, because you're not in flow. So that's a little bit of, I think, the paradox and the self-awareness to know when you're in one versus the other.
I think it's not only, possible, it's necessary, right? That, if you don't, you're actually doing a disservice to the company you're trying to build or the organization you're working in because you burn out and you end up kind of going down in flames.
Absolutely.
We're going to have to wrap up because we're coming up to time, but there's a great quote from Mike Vance that I sort of wanted to end on in your book, which was slowing down is sometimes the best way to speed up. It's very wise.
Yeah.
So listen, when's the book out? It might be out by the time this podcast comes out, actually.
The book comes out on November 2nd. And will be widely available. There is my website, Make Space to Lead, which will give you lots of the information and details.
And I'll put all the other links of where to find you in the show notes. Tutti, thanks so much. It's been lovely to chat. I feel like we could go on for another hour. Maybe we'll do it again sometime. Good luck with the book launch. I'm sure it'll have great impact, and I'm sure you'll get a lot of interest in it. Thanks so much for being my guest.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andy.
As I'm sure you're aware, you've been listening to Power of 10. My name is Andy Polaine. You can find me at apolaine on Twitter or polaine.com, where you can find more episodes and sign up for my newsletter, Doctor's Note. If you like the show, please take a moment to give it a rating on iTunes. It really helps others find us. And as always, get in touch if you have any comments, feedback, or suggestions for guests. All the links are in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.